Good morning. I'd like to convene the meeting of the Best Practice in Innovation Subcommittee. It is now 8:38, I believe.
Yeah.
Okay. And David and I are here in person, and I believe we have Nancy Golden on the phone. Is that true?
That's true, and Kevin Rowland, one of our administrators.
Nice. And Mark Mulvihill?
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning. Thanks for being here. And do we have Kay?
I saw an email saying Kay I didn't think could be here.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you all. I know we had OEIB meeting scheduled as well, and when that was canceled, we were wondering whether we would still be able to hold this meeting. I think it's very important that we get the time, especially for the topic that we have on the agenda today. I just want to mention, as a link to the last meeting, we did talk about achievement compacts, and we're not forgetting that work. We just know that there's some more work going on behind the scenes to get clear about the specific recommendations groups might be making around the achievement compacts, and we have a little more time to address that. So that topic will be on the agenda for our next meeting, which is on December 11th. Today on the agenda we have the main topic is serving our diverse populations, focusing specifically on our ELL students, engaging them, empowering them, supporting our families in culturally appropriate ways. We have allowed some time on the agenda this morning to just do a little bit of discussion first, and then we have invited testimony from Hillsborough School District. Mike Scott, Superintendent, Steve Larson, Assistant Superintendent, Office for School Performance, and Travis Reidman from ESL Migrant Education Director. So the team of the three of them will give us testimony. They do have a PowerPoint. We don't have that available for those of you on the phone, but I think that you'll find their presentation style is very story oriented, so I think it'll be fine for you to listen, and we can send that to you later. And then we have more time at the end of their testimony for discussion, and I'd like to have them stay at the table and be included in that discussion with us. So Rudy had planned to be with us and is traveling and wasn't able to get here today. I did have a conversation with him right before the meeting, and I know that he and I both are very, very anxious to get to some very concrete actions we'd like to see happen around this ELL work. And so my hope is that we will end today's meeting with hopefully some ideas about the directions we need to go, and maybe even some specific deliverables we might ask for. So before I ask for invited testimony, I would just like to know if members of this committee that are also on OEIB want to make any opening statements or express any sort of hope for us from today's conversation.
I just had a chance to look through the notes that Kathleen sent me on the work, and it's encouraging just basically to set the tone. It's very encouraging to see a commitment to try to develop best practices for our ELL population. I think and we've all recognized that we really have been independent and kind of alone on what to do with our kids. And to really be digging through the research, come up with best practices and develop a support system, I think is long overdue in Oregon.
Yeah, this is Nancy. I mean, this is a wonderful growing population for us, and I think I'm thrilled because it deserves the attention it's getting right now at sort of the state level, so we really can be strategic and make sure we're using evidence-based best practices.
I want to pause for just a minute. You guys have the notes because you probably looked at your computer. Seth, I know that Kathleen made a copy of the notes. So what they're referring to is, and I don't want to give away too much of the presentation, but there is a group of us, and it started with Mike Scott and I just having a conversation about what we could do better in our own school districts. Together we formed what we call the ELL Collaborative, and we've done some work together over a few years. Rudy had asked me to summarize that work and to provide at least my thinking about what the next steps might be, and that's the documentation that both Mark and Nancy are referring to. Seth is passing that out to everybody right now. And we can come back to these notes because I think that the real story will be in our presentation today. Any other comments before we start? Because I think it makes sense to move right to public testimony. We're a little bit ahead of what we said on the agenda, I think.
Yeah, I'd like to hear the presentation first.
Okay.
Go from there.
All right, so we'd like to invite the three of you to come forward, please. Thank you for taking the time. And more of you have joined us since we started. Thank you for coming to this really important conversation. Before you start, I do want to mention that I know Rudy and I and other members of this committee have really hoped that this committee opportunity will be more of an opportunity for discussion than we often don't have that much time at OEIB meetings to have those conversations. So we're hoping that today will be a start of how we might dive a little deeper into topics. All right. Excellent.
Thank you. For those folks on the phone, Mike Scott, Superintendent of Hillsborough, and I'll be kicking things off, and then I'll be passing off to Steve Larson. So what's on the screen right now is the number 3,383. And about 2.5 years ago, I asked in Hillsborough, how many ESL students, how many English language learners do we have in our school district? And the number is 3,383. And that's out of 20,000 students that make up the Hillsborough School District. The number that correlates with that is disturbing, is the number 1,522. And we know that based on our experience that 45% of our English language learners won't graduate from high school. And that number is 1,522. And that's the number that I think about. That's the number that I consider to be my number. And that's because of the language they speak, that's where they live, that is the income level of their families, because of the color of their skin. 1,522 won't graduate. For us, that is enough to fill a high school. That's enough to fill 2 middle schools. That's enough to fill 3 elementary schools. And somehow, historically, we've been okay with that number. And our goal has been to make this number known to everyone in our district and to make sure that we care enough to change this number. When we think about where we've gone with our equity work, or where we've gone with the work with our English language learners, it feels like we've been standing at the starting line for years now, and we've been saying, we've got these runners at the starting line, and we've been saying ready, 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 and we haven't hit set and we haven't hit go. And 3 years ago, I showed this slide to our administrative staff, and I asked them to commit to the equity work, to quit talking about it, and to start preparing to actually do something about it. When we made that commitment as an administrative team to move from ready, 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 and move to set and to go, we quit worrying about the adults in the system, and we started worrying about the students in the system. We put the students' needs ahead of the fears and the needs and the discomfort of our staff, who had we switched the agenda there, and we put the students' needs first. So I'm proud to say that we're ready, and we're at set and we're at go now. We pulled the trigger, and my goal all along was to create a movement that would positively impact the students that we serve, a movement that would bring value to the assets that our students possess. And in thinking about a movement, I think sometimes about other organizations out there that are successful. And the two that come to mind for me are Weight Watchers and Alcoholics Anonymous, AA. And I think about, why are those organizations more successful than other organizations that try and do the same work? And all I can come up with is that they are a community of believers that believe that they can make a difference. They're committed to the success of one another. They surround themselves with people who care and people who are committed to the same cause. So as I think about that in context to the work that we have to do for our English language learners, I think about what it is that we're truly facing. Is it an achievement gap that we have, or is it a systems gap, or is it an instructional gap? And I think it's all three of those. When we started talking about tackling this problem, about making a difference for our English language learners, about tackling that achievement gap and the systems gap and the instruction gap, one of the first things I did, Yvonne and I were both the new superintendents at the time, and so I called Yvonne and said, hey, here's what I'm thinking. Can we pull a group of people together, and can we start talking about this? And Yvonne and I were so new that we didn't understand that that's not something that was typically done. And so we said, yeah, let's do this. And that was really the start of the ELL Collaborative. It started out as a way to explore what instructional strategies would be the best for our students. And it turned into something much bigger, and it's evolved along the way. As we pulled the ELL Collaborative together, we invited a variety of districts to join us. We know that it's been said that an effective program, 90% of your students are going to benefit from that. And it was really clear that 90% of our English language learners were not benefiting. We knew that we had to make a change and we had to improve our program. We pulled the ELL Collaborative together. That included the Hillsborough School District, Forest Grove, Tigard Tualatin, Beaverton, the ESD, Salem Kaiser, and Portland Public. And I'm going to ask Steve here to go over some of the specific work that has been done in the ELL Collaborative and where we are at this point.
So Mike and Yvonne, when they called the collaborative or the group together, they gave the practitioners unprecedented access to solving the problem. They took the burden of proof away completely, so that the folks in the room, the ELL teachers, the principals, the administrators, to say, here's what we would do if you gave us the chance. And so that unique opportunity really put a responsibility on us to get it right. So we, as we were facilitated, we found that there were different parts of the problem that we needed solutions for. One was the assessments. Do we have the right assessments for our English language learners to mark progress over time? So there was a group that pulled off to start talking about that. Institutionalized racism. There are barriers in our systems, in our industry, that are keeping us from investing in the right structures for English language learners. We had a group that focused on that. Two other groups really worked on similar work. It kind of turned into one, which was best practices for English language learners. What are the instructional strategies and the systems that need to be in place to predict higher outcomes for English language learners? Those study groups essentially were to create policy implications or suggestions, and the superintendents agreed to move that work forward with the opportunities they have that's unique to a superintendent. So there are four different policy groups. Susan Inman is here from Oregon Department of Education. She's really been instrumental at moving each one of those policy groups forward. So if we have questions about that, she's here, and I've also participated on those as well. The one I want to talk about the most, though, is this statewide plan for ensuring academic excellence for English language learners. We refer to it as the rubric, essentially. So what happened here was practitioners from multiple districts, the 7 consortium districts, analyzed the research that's out there to find out where there's triangulation in terms of what the adults do in the system to predict higher outcomes for English language learners. The thing that we found, it's pretty predictable, is that regardless of what you choose to do, the way in which you do it and the quality in which you do it predicts the outcome. So it doesn't matter what you pick. If you don't do it well, it's not going to work. So what we identified, and this was from work with Claude Goldenberg and Kathy Escamilla from the University of Colorado, is that there are certain structures that you can invest in, like literacy, English language development, leadership, that if you do those well and you benchmark progress over time, you're likely to have higher outcomes for English language learners. So each one of these bullets, there's 8, have been vetted with a variety of targets that would suggest just started all the way up to sustained results. You're really moving this work forward. The potential in this rubric is large in that when you agree on what you're going to monitor, the targets in which you're going to hold yourself accountable, it creates the opportunity for statewide or cross-district collaboration. And that's what it did, at least in Salem Kaiser and the Hillsborough School District, most notably. The thing that we realized that although you have a variety of strategies that the adults can invest in, one thing does matter most, and that's the program model that you choose to implement in your school system. Travis will talk a little bit more about this, but this is that famous Collier and Thomas graph where 6 million students are in this research to find out what program model, if you do it well, will produce kids that are college and career ready. And without a doubt, you can see that the two-way dual instructional model, again, if you do it well, produces way better results than what in Hillsborough we've invested in over years, which is the pull-out ESL. So we show this in a way to say that the way you talk about your program model for English language learners really sets the course for you to be able to implement over time and build resources so that you can sustain it over time. So then I'm going to send it over to Travis.
Thank you. So each of the 6 million students in the Thomas and Collier study has a face and a story and a hope for a life of opportunity. And as a bilingual assistant and as a teacher and as a principal, I had the opportunity to work with a lot of emerging bilinguals, English-only students, and I've seen these program models in action. The 6 million students in this study reveal that if a student is able to learn in 2 languages, a lot of the students that I worked with were able to learn in Spanish as their primary language and English as their second language. If they're allowed to learn in 2 languages, we can predict extraordinary success for those students in English. I'm going to tell a story about a student named Anna at a school that I worked at. The data from this graph might be counterintuitive. People will ask, why does more Spanish, why does more primary language, and for many more years, predict above average performance in English for an English learner? In fact, we know that if Anna has the opportunity to learn math, science, writing, music in her first language from the first day she enters school, we know that she'll excel across the curriculum in her primary language and in English. By telling the story of Anna coming to school with her language as an asset, we've allowed her to be cognitively challenged from the beginning, rather than her waiting to learn English to have access to rigorous content. When I tell the story of Anna, and we focus on her language as an asset and not a deficit, we realize that she will, according to the research and according to personal experience, she'll outperform the 50th percentile in terms of her achievement in English reading, as well as other content areas. By the way, the opposite is true. If we provide an English-only experience for Anna, we might predict that she will underperform. A common misperception is that more English early is better for our emerging bilinguals, and according to the research, we know that that's not the best program model. So in a handout that
what's one-way dual?
So one way would be where you have a population of students who speak a language like Spanish or Russian or Mandarin, and they're together in a cohort, learning in their primary language first and transitioning into English as the target language. Two-way is where you have a population of students who speak a target language like Spanish or Russian or Mandarin, as well as a population of English-only students. They learn each other's language in a two-way immersion or a two-way dual program. Both of those are the programs, according to the Thomas and Collier research, that would outperform the 50th percentile in terms of NCEs, normed curve equivalencies. So the handout that you have tells 2 stories, and for those on the conference call, I'd love to forward this handout to you because it tells about how we could tell a story about a 5-year-old named Anna who enters school and we treat her language as an asset. The other story is how we might treat her language as a deficit within our system. So I'd be happy to forward that. We have to ask ourselves some questions about Anna's school if we treat her language as an asset. We know from the Collier and Thomas graph that her English scores won't peak until later grades. So we might make the mistake of thinking that our school, if it sets up a bilingual program, is underperforming if we look at her English scores in 3rd grade. On our handout, there's a few questions regarding our accountability system as it stands. We have to ask ourselves what programs and practices we are reinforcing by assessing our students in English only in terms of our achievement outcomes. By holding ourselves accountable to achievement outcomes in English only, are we discouraging the implementation of the best programs for our emerging bilinguals and our English learners? I think we have the opportunity in Oregon to empower schools to use programs predictive of long-term success for English learners. And to do this, we must acknowledge early achievement in literacy and content in a student's primary language. Additionally, I'd like to share a couple of faces that tell the story of the broad benefits of culturally and linguistically responsive programs and practices for English learners. This is Hannah and Fidencio, two students at an elementary school in Hillsborough that has a dual language program. Hannah entered school as an English-only student. Fidencio is Spanish-only in his house. Both of them are holding certificates. They won their grade levels in a Spanish spelling bee in Forest Grove. Hannah and Fidencio are faces that represent for me college and career readiness and the trajectory toward becoming college and career ready. What's interesting about this photo for me is that this is a highest poverty school and perhaps a school with the largest Latino population in Hillsborough that sometimes gets stereotyped as a low performing school. But this represents for me the opportunities available to both of these students via a dual language program, K6. So the point of the human face to the statistics around different program models is that the best programs for English learners represent for me the best programs for all Oregon students. There are broad benefits for implementing these programs. I'm going to pass it back to Mike.
So I started off the presentation with a number, and the number that I had on the screen originally was 3,383, the number of English language learners in the Hillsborough School District. The number on the screen now is 63,151. That's the number of English language learners in the state of Oregon. And if we were to look at the four-year cohort, the graduate rate for the four-year cohort, we know that 33,470 won't graduate in the state of Oregon. Those are students that are currently in our system right now, 33,470 that will not graduate if we don't do business a little differently, if we don't make this a priority in the state of Oregon. We know that these students will live a life of less. We know that they're not going to be contributors in the system as they could be unless we do something different. We need to believe that we can make a difference. I love this quote here. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go further. If you want to go far, go together. As individual districts, we can go fast. We can definitely go fast. We can make progress and we can make a difference for the individual students in our districts. But as a state, we can go far. If we take this as a priority, if we hold ourselves accountable, if we engage in some thoughtful dialogue around this issue, if we stop worrying about the politics around this issue and start worrying about the kids in the system, we can go far and we can go further than we can if we go alone. I don't pretend to be an expert in this area, but I see three opportunities for us as a state that if we act on, that we're going to be miles ahead. The first opportunity I believe is being bilingual must be communicated as a value for becoming career and college ready in the state of Oregon from the earliest grades. We need to claim bilingualism as a value so that when the going gets tough, it doesn't get pushed aside. The second opportunity I believe that we have is our state accountability system. The manner in which we talk about the achievement of our students must reinforce that value of bilingualism. We must allow our students to demonstrate proficiency in their primary language, and that currently is not an option for our students. And the third opportunity is the continued development of statewide resources, networks, and momentum will prove to be critical for continuous improvement to occur. Going together, we're going to go further. I'm going to end with this quote here. I said to my children, this Martin Luther King quote, I said to my children, I'm going to work and do everything that I can to see that you get a good education. I don't ever want you to forget that there are millions of God's children who will not and cannot get a good education. And I don't want you feeling that you are better than they are, for you will never be what you ought to be until they are what they ought to be. We've talked about pulling the ELL Collaborative back together, and that's something that we're happy to do. We're also happy to expand the circle or to hand it off if that's what's best for the students in the state of Oregon. But the bottom line is we've got an opportunity here. Statewide collaboration between districts is at an all-time high. Many of us work together and problem solve together. Many of us collaborate together. And many of us have made closing this achievement gap the #1 priority in our school districts. And we'll make a bigger difference if we can move together in that work. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. I just want to make one comment, and then I want to open it up to the committee, and I'd like to invite you three to stay with us in the conversation. First, I just want to say for myself, this is an issue that matters at my heart and soul, and I think you can see that's true for these three men in front of us and for the people in their school district. I think many of us in the state are at that point of feeling this huge sense of urgency. We've talked a really long time. We have some concrete ideas to move forward on, and we're ready to hit that let's go button. So that's what I'm hoping our conversation focuses on today. I think that the passion you hear in this presentation, especially as you hear the stories and the passion in each one of us, is what will fuel this work, but we've got to be clear, and I think Mike modeled really well what happens when the leaders are very clear about what is our responsibility, what we need to do to move forward, and then is really, really clear about continuing to reinforce where we're going as they start moving down the pathway. I'd just like to open it up to committee members. I'll start with David, since you're right here, and then move to the phone.
So, as an outcome of this collaborative, are you now implementing two-way dual or one-way dual, for example, bilingual instruction across the board, across the district, in all 7 of these districts?
So, referring back to the 8 bullet points, the things that we agreed that we would hold ourselves accountable to, that's taken a variety of different forms in different districts. For us, what we did is we chose 3 of those and created our own rubrics for our principals to be able to monitor progress for the implementation of sheltered instruction, English language development, and bilingual education. So we have, like you saw, we had 2 schools that were dual language schools. Travis was the principal at one. We now have 4 more. And we're continuing to add where we have capacity of English language learners and community interest. We kind of can't keep up with the demand, is what we're noticing. Our parents want this. Our English-only parents want this because it produces college and career-ready kids.
We currently have waiting lists at some of our schools to get into this program. The key, though, is, and Steve touched on this before, when you implement a dual language program, you want to do it well. You don't want the conversation to ever be around, oh, dual language isn't effective. What's not effective is the implementation. And so we want to be really careful about that. So we make sure before we ever offer dual language to expand to another school, we want to make sure that the staff and the leadership at that school has the capacity and the readiness for that.
Another outcome, David, from the ELL Collaborative has been an increased network of support among the districts who are members. Just yesterday, I took a team of principals to Portland Public and visited Michael Bacon, who runs their Mandarin immersion programs, and then we went to Wilsonville and met with Kathy Ludwig, the assistant superintendent there, to learn about their Mandarin bilingual programs. So at the same time that as a district we're working to expand our options and grow our bilingual options up through secondary schools, we're also networking to figure out how to support each other, promote staff development, recruit new teachers, and improve our programs across different languages.
And you picked 3 of the 8 bullet points to go on to develop a rubric for accountability and assessing the system. Have you compared with the other districts and what they've chosen to go with for accountability assessment tools and structures for their systems? And how's that discussion going, or that kind of collaboration going?
Our tightest collaboration has probably been with Salem Kaiser School District, and they had initiated a project with Claude Goldenberg himself to take the 8 items and start building out a research framework to see if we in fact do these well, will they raise student achievement. So they're in that process, continuing with that. We've really connected so tightly that our work around dual language instruction has been backed by the relationship, the partnership.
We're also trying to figure out how to backward map from the Oregon University system in terms of our assessment in English and Spanish, so that when students graduate from our high schools, that they'll be recognized as college-ready bilingual students. So next week we'll be meeting with Western Oregon, for example, to figure out how to create a pathway for young bilingual students to become teachers and come back to our community and work in our schools. So a critical part of that conversation is an assessment and accountability system for language proficiency, but also for literacy and content in both languages. We need teachers who can teach biology and math, for example, at the high school level in Spanish, and the way to do that is to teach Algebra 2 at Hillsborough High School, which we've just started doing with a new teacher this year. So.
I would also say that the Oregon Department of Education has stepped up in a big way in furthering the partnership and the cross-district collaboration. The work that the Title III department has done has really allowed us to innovate with new practices and ultimately hold ourselves accountable.
Yeah, and I would echo that, and I'm glad Susan Inman is here today. That just the feeling of collaboration, the spirit of cooperation that we're now receiving from the Department of Ed has just been wonderful. It's helped move the conversation and move this work forward in a quick way.
Nancy or Mark?
You want to go first, Mark, and then I'll go?
Sure. I want to go back to the slide where it shows the long-term achievement by program model.
Call your slide.
That to me was pretty compelling. You know which one I'm talking about?
Yeah,
we have it in front of us.
Can you elaborate a little more on that as far as, is this ELPA, is this Oaks?
Yeah.
Have there been any crosswalks between that? AMAOs? Can you just maybe elaborate a little more on this document? It's pretty compelling to me.
Yeah, and this is Travis. We had the opportunity to talk to Thomas and Collier about this research, and so when we say 6 million students, that's mostly across the United States, and this graph represents what we would call Oaks reading. So this would be an English reading test, and then the NCEs are normed curved equivalencies, which basically means you take the 50th percentile. That blue dotted line across the top represents the 50th percentile. So for us it would be 50th percentile in English Oaks reading achievement among students, all students. And then you see each line represents across the grade levels what we would predict an English learner to score in an English Oaks test across the grade levels. So by the way that I look at that top blue line for two-way dual would be a student who's a English learner in my school district. If we provided a two-way dual program, we could predict that by third grade they'd be above the 40th percentile and wouldn't reach the 50th until 5th grade. But then after 5th grade, we would actually predict above average performance on Oaks reading for that English learner who started as an English learner, but as we know would probably be fully bilingual by that point.
Now it's interesting when we have some homegrown experience to go with this graph as well. Travis was a principal of a dual language school, and a couple years we've had a couple dual language schools for the last several years, and our students that have been involved in dual language are outperforming those students not involved in dual language in the same school. So we've got some home examples as well.
We actually ran into a problem where the students in the dual classrooms were outperforming the students who didn't have access to the dual language classrooms, and among the staff and as a leadership team, we decided that we needed to create dual language opportunities for all students who enroll in the school because there was an internal equity issue in terms of our program model. And the data, as a district, we can't brag yet about closing the achievement gap. We still have a long way to go, but in these pockets of excellent programs, we're seeing students out-achieving their peers by a long shot given the proper program and instructional strategies.
Well, this is great because, I've heard so much debate on programs and teacher quality and, the same old things. And right, finally see, so this is nationalized norm data for reading. is what you're saying, basically.
With 6 million students.
English reading.
Okay. Do we have any similar type of data in Oregon?
So what you'll, the reason, this is Steve Larson, Mark, great questions. You can look at this Collier and Thomas graph and compare it across the program models that are implemented in the state, and you get pretty similar trajectories. Certainly in Hillsborough, we could map our ELL performance in reading on the pull-out ESL, and we had about the same, if not a little bit larger, of an achievement gap by the time kids were 11th grade. An important thing to note on this graph, and we point out, is that all program models produce third grade readers. The trajectory is up. And that's predictable because the type of reading kids are doing in the state test at third grade is very different than what they're having to perform with at 11th grade, or as they go up through higher level content. So we point that out a lot, is that we're in this for the long term. Third grade test scores are great, but we want to make sure that those maintain and correlate to high school test scores. The other thing to think about here too is that this isn't ELPA. This is how students perform in reading, and that's really where the rubber hits the road. Is we don't want students just to be proficient in English. We want them to be able to perform in content with their English skills.
Right. So I love this, and I'll stop here. I could go on and on about this, so I'll just tie it up. Maybe, Yvonne, what we look at is developing a similar graph with the models, because this is what I see districts asking for. Show me what the research is for the best models. So as I look at this, and it's tied to third grade reading, maybe we could do an Oregon version to show third grade reading, which is our key strategic investment, then also graduation rates, 4-year, 5-year, and look at how the kids longitudinally have done within these models. That might be something, that I think districts would love. Second thing that I've always been intrigued about is language for even our Anglo population that are in poverty. Now, I've always felt like you could take a poverty Anglo first grader and they couldn't pass ELPA either because of limited vocabulary. And I'm almost wondering if that might be a value add to a two-way dual like you're talking about. You see what I mean?
Yeah. Good.
Because it impacts all kids.
Mm-hmm.
The one caution I would have, Mark, I like your idea of the having an Oregon, have some Oregon statistics there. When you have a smaller sample of districts that have done these programs well, it's going to be more difficult to get. It'll be interesting to see what kind of statistics we can get out of that. So if we know that implementation of these programs, if done well, are going to get results, what we don't know, I guess, is how well these have been done in the state of Oregon.
And actually, I'm glad you mentioned that. I will offer up our school district as an example of what I would say has not been careful and intentional implementation. When I went to Forest Grove, I found out that we had been working on implementing dual language for 20 years. We have it in 3 elementary schools, and our data does not look like this. One of the other things we found is that not only did the data not look like this where we could get the data, but we didn't have good ways of tracking which kids had been in which program. And what we've been doing since I've been there is trying to peel back the layers to figure out why are we not getting these kinds of results. And the things that these 3 guys just mentioned, first of all about implementation, but what we found as a district, there was no real clarity around first the model. There was no real intentional resourcing of that commitment. So the commitment didn't seem to me, when I saw several years later, that the commitment was really there. The professional development hadn't been provided for teachers. There weren't resources available. We were still trying to figure out what assessments we were using and arguing about the data on those different assessments. With the budget cuts, teachers were being moved around as per contract, but not as much care taken about who was teaching what languages, and were we unraveling some of the work around those models. And really now we're kind of back to square one, which is one of the reasons I wanted to work with Mike, is because we had what was supposed to be this great model and we believe in it, but it wasn't working for us that way. And I don't think we're unique. I think you're going to find more schools like our district across the state if you try to look back longitudinally. And I think part of that is the stuck place we are with assessments and clarity about the program. But I also think it's the policies. When you look at even, for example, the Achievement Compact, the fact that we're saying kids need to reach these levels of English literacy in 3rd grade, we really need to look at, when we develop policies or expectations, do we disincentivize the idea of some of these programs, which I know you mentioned at the very beginning. So I could go on and on about that, because that's what Mike and I have gone on and on about for a few years now. And it really feels different now that we have partners across the state that are together sort of linking arms and saying, we believe that the research is conclusive that dual language makes a difference. Now we just need to figure out all those pieces we need to put in place to get that to work.
How to do it well.
Mark, one of the things that I love your question, because it's really making me think here. One of the things that we have tried to do in Hillsborough is we've switched the burden of proof. So if the research is conclusive about which programs work, typically the way, back in the day in Hillsborough, we kind of left it up to the ESL director to prove to us why their latest model is going to work. And what we've done now is we've said, okay, the research shows us that it works. The burden of proof is no longer on the ESL director. It is now, it's on all of us to put these programs into place. One of the pieces of data that we pulled that was really interesting is that, for years we've had pull-out programs for ESL. And we sometimes have some of our elementary schools and teachers and principals, and we kind of patted ourselves on the back because these big spikes we got in the 3rd grade reading results. And what we did is we tracked those students and we followed them, and we were able to show that as they went through their career in the Hillsborough School District, their levels of achievement dropped off. Yes, we can get them to spike in English in 3rd grade, but if we're just doing a pull-out program, then it's pretty clear that their achievement is going to drop off over time, and that bears out in the Thomas and Collier graph as well.
I want to add one comment, and then I was going to move to Nancy, and we can come back around. I also wanted to mention, when you talked about looking long-term, what we did find in Forest Grove, and what I found when I got there, so I don't get to take any credit for it, but Forest Grove High School is closing the achievement gap, and graduating kids college and career ready, going on to college, getting scholarships to go to 4-year programs. And so it was a mystery to figure out why we were not getting the results at the younger grades, and yet we still are getting these results before kids exit. And without data, it's really hard to figure that out, but I continue to wonder if some of those things that are hard to measure about using an asset approach. So for 20 years, our students, their native language was honored. And we have kids in the dual language program, but all the kids in those schools that are not in the dual language program, that go eventually to English only program, also get Spanish literacy only for their first 3 years. So they get a portion of a dual language sort of approach. And what I see in our school district is kids that are staying in school, connected to school, have strong identities, feel successful. So while our reading results don't necessarily show that at the younger grades, I continue to wonder, even though they're significantly below grade level when they get to high school, and we have very intentional interventions that are sort of pull-out workshop on top of the core curriculum, I just continue to wonder that because we've at least had the asset approach, kids have stayed connected to school, have had a strong identity, we've been able to build a college-going culture, and eventually they get there, even though we know there's still some fixing we need to do at the younger grade levels in terms of really getting those results earlier. We know we're on the way to that, And I'm really glad that what we're fixing is the front end, where it's a little easier, and that we're already getting those results at the high school level. I think if we had not had those kids in dual language programs, we would look like other school districts with our demographics across the country. Nancy, did you want to jump in?
Yeah. And first of all, to the Hillsborough team, thank you for your leadership, and to you too, Yvonne. It's terrific. I really appreciate it. Leadership matters. So, I just have sort of a line of inquiry, and I might have some wrong assumptions in here. So, if I could just go through it, and then in the end, if you could tell me if there's wrong assumptions. But I'm trying to view this as an OEIB member who is responsible for all the children in the state and all the children representing all the different languages. So I'm thinking about, Springfield, which is about 11,000, has probably 15 languages. Portland probably has 40 different languages. My assumption is, and I might have this wrong, when we're talking about dual language, it's probably in like Spanish, I heard Mandarin, maybe Russian, but it's not in all the 40 languages. But I did hear that research says you should first teach in your native language and then in English, that's best practice. So I just think about all the other kids who come from other countries, equally as wonderful kids, equally deserving. And so I'm thinking about scaling up, because this is a state level committee. So I guess my question is, I get that sometimes you have to say, maybe in our community there's many more Spanish speaking as their first language, so we might focus there. But if we were to really scale up for all the children in Oregon, I kind of move to what would it cost, what would it really take? Because if a recommendation comes out like that, the next thing I start moving to is the governor's budget's coming out next week. That's the governor's budget. But then we get into legislative session where there's going to be a lot of advocacy about money. So I guess from a committee point of view, do you know what I'm getting at? I mean, what is this about? How do we meet the language needs using evidence-based practice for all the kids who don't have English as a first language? And if we're really saying, this is what we need to do, either go to these dual or make sure kids are taught in their first language, what would the cost of that be? And what would the impact of that cost be on, all the other areas of people telling us, all the testimony we've heard about all the other needs too. So I know that's... any thoughts about that?
So Nancy, this is Mike, and I'm going to turn it to Travis and Steve just after I make a comment here. You're absolutely right. It is not prudent or appropriate for dual language to be in every school with every population. I mean, that is just something we can't pull off. When you have a large number of students in one school and that's possible, then you can see from the research that's a very appropriate model. But that's not what we're preaching here at all, that we think dual language should be the way to go. In fact, Travis or Steve, if you could talk about the English language development and the rubric work that was done within the collaborative, that would be probably more appropriate for OEIB as opposed to the whole focus on dual.
It's wonderful knowing about it, and it's certainly a strategy. But, at some point at the state level, you got to go, well, what are we recommending and what's the cost?
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, excellent.
When talking to our researchers that really help us with this work, Kathy Escamilla to be the chief among the group, the decision is if you can, you should. Because using a student's primary language in their instruction creates an asset-based model, and all of the benefits that Travis talked about start to come with that. But Nancy, that question was the first one we had to reconcile with in the collaborative, because not all of us had those programs, but all of us were seeing declines in student achievement over time. So the big piece for us is how we talked about English language development. A model of pulling kids away to learn English separate from content or separate from the standards isn't working. It's not producing kids who understand the concepts they need to succeed 4th, 5th, 6th grade on up. So the way we develop this rubric with Dr. Escamilla is ELD needs to be done in a focused and integrated way. And so you see that in our rubric. I'll have Travis kind of go into that, but that's been a real content or a real focus for our collaboration is how do we do ELD better so that every English language learner in our state has access to content.
And do we have this rubric? I know I got the PowerPoint, but is the rubric
I have
part of the PowerPoint?
We'll get that to you.
Thank you.
And I just want to mention that the rubric, so Hillsborough has taken those 3 areas of the rubric and further developed them. One of the pieces of work that the collaborative in our last meeting, and we haven't met in probably a year and a half, I think, we agreed still needed to be done is a more further developing of that rubric. And maybe Salem has that because they've been working with Claude, I don't know. But I know that Hillsborough fully developed those 3 areas, but I think that's one of the pieces of work we could vet as a whole state to further develop that rubric so we could all use that tool.
And in Hillsborough, Nancy, we focused on ELD and sheltered instruction and bilingual education as our focus points in that rubric. So even a school that isn't considering bilingual education, that has huge language diversity, would have answers in terms of how to implement more effective programs for those diverse ELLs. The way that I've thought about it in my mind is that as OEIB, I understand your question is how at the state level could we take action and what would be the cost, and is it all about bilingual ed? And my answer would be no. Really, if getting back to that Thomas and Collier graph, if our assessment system right now allowed for primary language assessment in literacy, that would be one thing that OEIB could do at low cost that would really just remove barriers for schools that are looking to implement those bilingual programs, no matter what the language, whether it be Russian or Mandarin or Spanish or Vietnamese in the future. The way that I think about it in the Thomas and Collier graph is that bottom trajectory is the result we could expect if we just do pull-out ELD. So as you add content-based ELD, Susan Inman and her team are actually leading a consortium of states that is implementing or drawing up new content-based ELP standards. So the future iteration of the ELPA 21, will be based on an integrated language proficiency and content set of standards. So you can predict better outcomes with that purple line for content-based ELD. And then I heard Yvonne say that in Forest Grove, even students not in dual got Spanish literacy early. That would be an example of an early exit transitional program. So I guess the story for me is, from the most basic pull-out ELD model, if you can start integrating language development across the curriculum, and then eventually, as your language population warrants it, investing in teachers who can teach those kids to read in their first language, you move on up through the trajectories toward outperforming the 50th percentile. I hope that makes sense, because that's Thomas and Collier's life work, and they could talk to you about it for 10 hours, and it's really fascinating stuff. But I think the programmatic implications for us are how to look beyond pull-out ELD and how to integrate language development by giving our teachers more skills. In Hillsborough, we've invested a lot of money in taking classroom teachers who normally aren't seen as ELL specialists and giving them the ELD training that is normally reserved for our ELL specialists across the state. We think that by becoming language experts, we can help kids across the content and therefore predict better outcomes. So it's while it might seem depressing to settle for one of those models that's not dual, you're totally right by saying that we have 70 languages represented in my district alone, 40 languages in our ELL program. So what's the answer for a student who comes speaking Tagalog who can't benefit from our Spanish-English dual program? That's a really important question, in that the rubric that came out of the ELL Collaborative has the answers in terms of how to do ELD across the content and how to do sheltered instruction.
Okay, and we'll get that rubric.
Yeah.
So, okay, great. Thank you. That clarifies a great deal for me.
So I'm looking at the time, and we have an hour left for this meeting. And in my conversation with Rudy right before this, when he let me know that he wasn't going to be able to make it, he gave me sort of a charge for this committee, and I would like to move to that. It's okay to ask other questions as we come along. But I think the question for us is, if we were to say, as a committee, what are the maybe 3 or 4 or 5 big buckets of work that we would identify that we think need to be done as a state moving forward, what would they be? And then in each of those buckets, what might be some possible deliverables? And so I'd like to just include the committee as well as those at the table, and maybe there are those out in the audience that want to chime in as well. So I'm going to ask first our guests, if you could identify what would, you have given us some recommendations, but if you can even get more specific about that would be helpful.
So our first recommendation is just, it's free. It's the kind of validation or momentum that we put as a community around language as an asset, and that we want in Oregon for our graduates to be considered bilingual. And that, as Travis said, that just opens up a whole new dialogue around how we monitor that progress over time for our English language learners, for our English-only students who are learning a second language. The part that will cost the largest amount of money is developing a robust accountability system that allows us to do this. Because it does mean buying more assessments or translating assessments in a way that it's authentic. So our number 2 suggestion really is what will take the most time, I think. The third is equipping the Oregon Department of Education with the resources they need to support this network of continuous improvement. Be it around the rubric or not, we know that if people are going to implement bilingual programs or dual language programs, or even just really good English language development programs, they're going to need resources. And ODE has kind of proven to have the team leadership in order to start putting that together. So that would be my recommendation.
I think I've already said it too, but as a building principal, I felt like having to hold ourselves accountable and celebrate only our English OAKS data or ELPA data was a barrier to us implementing the best programs for our English learners. So a revision of how the compact or the report card reports our achievement. A student like Anna would benefit from us recognizing that her achievement of grade level literacy skills at kinder, first, second, and third grade predicts college and career readiness for her if she's literate in Spanish by third grade. It could be that her trajectory toward biliteracy shows that her English literacy peaks later, but we need to be able to celebrate the successes of our best programs via an accountability system that honors primary language literacy and content. So I think what that would require is that at a state level we recognize what assessments we could use to show literacy, grade level normed literacy in languages like Spanish, Russian, Mandarin, Vietnamese, our highest language populations.
I think the only thing I would add to that is if we continue to only assess our students in English, then we're really driving districts towards that pull-out model, which is the most ineffective model of all of them. And that just concerns me. The more emphasis that we put on that, it seems like we're shooting ourselves in the foot in terms of looking at other models that would be more effective in the long run.
And this is Nancy. I mean, I'm familiar. There's no, like, with, federal testing, No Child Left Behind. Is there anything that beyond the state that's saying we need to, be testing our kids at these benchmarks test in English? Is that something we created, or is that created even at a federal level?
There are quite a few states that accept scores in a student's native language as representation of their meeting the standards. So,
okay, great.
We did at one time. We had the Apprenda at 3rd grade, and it was cut resource. That's why I say that this is the more expensive one. We used to, and now we don't.
Right. Okay.
How about members of the committee? As you're thinking about this, what would you identify, if you have any additional ones in addition to those 3, what would you identify as the buckets of work?
Well, this is Nancy again. First of all, I need to say, for a collaborative that's been meeting for a number of years, I really feel your recommendations weigh very heavy with me, because I don't have the expertise that you do or have committed the time to understand it as deeply. So I like those recommendations.
Okay.
I do think as we move to the longitudinal database, we really look at, and I know it's kind of been stated already, but, that we really are deliberate in putting this population and the data into that database. I mean, really calling it out. If we're serious about the Achievement Compact, then we really need to call that out as we define the database in the coming years.
Yeah, and I can support that as long, and I know you didn't mean this, Mark, but I'm in so many groups where people first say, let's get data, and then the data never comes together, and it creates inaction for the rest of them. So I love the way you said it, which is you move forward on these other recommendations, and as you're doing that, you're committed to taking data, but that we're not waiting for data that prevents us from really providing services to kids right away.
Absolutely. In the Oregon model, there's always hope for another committee.
Yeah.
And that's why I see this parallel track.
Mark, I'd also like to piggyback on something that you said about the data longitudinally. One of the struggles we've had is to track the success of English learners who reclassify by passing the ELPA with a 5. So if I do really well for Anna and her siblings in my school, she may become a fully English proficient student in the eyes of the state and the nation in 3rd grade. And by 9th grade, I've lost my ability to see that she benefited from a dual language program, because that tag of former ELL or whatever it might be doesn't follow her. So one of the huge struggles with NCLB as a principal was, if I do well teaching a student English, I might actually get dinged with my achievement scores because I don't have as many ELLs anymore. I reclassified them all. So
absolutely. I remember as a principal that same dance. Yeah, the more success you have, the more you struggle with your results.
So which
is obviously backward, and I think from the OEIB perspective, we again need to emphasize where we're trying to go with the waiver.
Yep.
Where we're trying to go with the outcomes being kids completing and looking at them over time. Those strategic areas: 3rd grade reading, 4-year, 5-year cohort, bachelor's degrees, the completion rather than getting dinged for, having success on ELPA.
So, Mark, to those points, this is Steve Larson again. We've got so many areas of celebration right now in our state around this. There's great momentum. Number one, dual language is identified in the waiver as an option for schools that have hit the priority or focus school list. Again, it's just recognizing that the research says do this well, and it should work. We also have, to that longitudinal data collection, Doug Costy's team at ODE has started those calculations so that we can actually make some predictions based on how students do on ELPA and how what the corresponding prediction would be on OAKS. So we've got some great momentum at the state level already around the things that you're asking for.
And Mark or Nancy, did you want to add anything else to that?
I'd just like to add that, I agree with the other members of the committee. We don't need to go down the path of further micromanagement as far as accountability is concerned, that we have to be looking at the big picture, and that is completion rates. And I liked in the presentation you were focusing on that too, how many English language learners are not graduating, which is our primary outcome here. I'm also very impressed with this collaborative and the way it's working. I know we've seen that with the Eastern Promise and others too, and I have a lot of faith in the education system to really do that, to come together and work together. And I know there's been some talk about regional hubs or regional collaboratives at various sectors in education doing the same thing. And I'm just curious, from your point, working in this collaborative, was there anything, or is there anything the state helped facilitate or could facilitate if we were to bring this to other regions or encourage other districts to get together in a like manner, whether it's with English language learning or special education or just other challenges in the education system? Is there anything the state could facilitate with that, whether it's with attitudes or resources or assessment systems, and anything along that scale, anything that's occurred to you?
Yeah, well, we found it to be a very powerful model. As we started pulling the districts together, and the original invite was the invite to the superintendents, and please choose 3 or 4 of your best thinkers around this area. It proved to be a really powerful model. And then once we got the Department of Ed involved and their willingness to go down the road and help facilitate these other committees, that was incredibly helpful as well. So, incredibly powerful model. People that were committed to the work, that wanted to be there, that were invested in long-term outcomes. Very, very good model.
You know, this is Nancy. One thing, you know, that this makes me think about is, you know, there's just a beginning conversation as we look at achievement compacts of a concept around regional compacts, you know, and then maybe a pilot. You know, this sort of reinforces my belief that might be a good idea, because I agree with the collaboratives you're talking about. I think you're a great model, but I have to go right away to, so how do they do in community college? How do they do in four-year colleges? I guess, you know, so, you know, this whole idea that as a region, if you could own each other's outcomes on the compacts, that might even get more powerful, because, you know, the ultimate goal is 40-40-20. And, you know, you know what I'm saying? The conversation around K-12 is only part of the pathway.
Yeah, yeah.
So I just want to add to that question of yours, David, because I've been thinking about this a lot. I think absolutely ODE could play that leadership role in convening. I think one of the things that Mike and I found hugely valuable to us is, first of all, we didn't have to count on our own expertise, which we found was really not there yet. And just, you know, that power of having the conversation together, and sometimes within districts and sometimes within regions, but more in districts. I found, having been in 5 different districts in the state, that you start to swim around in your same old conversation sometimes. And so when you expand the conversation to bring others from the region, and where I think we need to look at next is beyond our state. And that was something we talked about when we developed the rubric and started running them by the 2 researchers we were working with. As a collaborative, we have a huge vision that we haven't even barely touched the surface of today, because we thought there were many areas you could work at. But with leadership and a convener, you could grow those ideas. Mike and I trying to do it on top of our district work and finding the time to get together was challenging. But I want to mention another thing that I think was important, an important decision we made early on, and that is when districts said, could we join the collaborative, we said only if the superintendent will commits to being a part of the work and stays there. So you can't send your team and then hope to catch up with them later. You got to be in the conversation. And I think a real powerful development out of that came when teachers, and I know Steve was a part of that group that was looking at best practices, then turned around to superintendent and said, okay, you all have just been listening to us, but now we're telling you there's something you need to go do. And that is, you need to go work on the policy pieces and those other things, which they did mention. So what I added to your number 3 about this idea of leadership at a central level, which could be centered in ODE and delivered through a regional delivery kind of model, What I've written down right now is that the spirit of this whole collaborative approach, I think, needs to be embedded in our methodology about how we go about this. The second one is how powerful it was to sort of task what I call the doers, the teachers and the leaders in the buildings, with tell us those concrete barriers or the concrete things to celebrate, because those concrete stories or examples are what really moves us along. And so I think identifying those two things is part of that leadership work. The other part, I think, is part of the leadership work that could be done in a central place, is that looking outside, where are those experts? Rudy, I know, said to me, wow, it feels like Oregon's a little bit behind. There's other states that have been working on this for a long time. And I know that was my aha, because I started in California. And I remember coming to the conversation and thinking, oh my gosh, are we just starting this conversation? I've already been doing it for 10 years, and that was 31 years ago. And so I think that we just need to invite not only more people in the state to the conversation, but also across the state. And I want to highlight two other things that I don't think we have raised up, and I'd like to right now to see if anybody comes up with more specific deliverables. And that is the idea that you mentioned earlier about model development. I think I would label that another number 4. So if you have the collaborative come together again, we have a rubric. So part of that work would be further vetting that rubric, finding out if there's more components, and if we could really fill out that rubric so everybody could use it. But that was a dream of the collaborative, is that we would then use that rubric and use the model that I know Susan's already worked on at ODE of this peer review idea. So we imagined early on, maybe there's some staff members from Beaverton, Hillsborough, and Forest Grove, and we get to go look at one another's programs on a regular basis and use this rubric to look at those programs and start to identify what is a set of outside eyes who are trying to do the same thing seeing about our program, so we could further our learning and further our dialogue. So I think we could do that in the state, but we could also do that across the country. So if we could identify the models, and I don't know what the deliverables are under there, I guess probably identify where those models are. One of the things I did ask Kathy Askamia when she was here, I think it was last December for the OLN conference, we were having dinner, and I asked her, so where are those places across the country? If I wanted to find a school or a district that is implementing these models and getting the results all the way through the system, where can I find them? And she said, at least in her research, she was finding it hard to find an entire district especially, and also hard to find entire schools, because what matters is the teaching. So here we are back around full circle to that piece about it's the teacher that matters and the implementation of those effective strategies. So while it might be part of the development, I think looking at that whole bucket of curriculum design, because we talked about different things. There's the native literacy pieces that need to be there, but then there's also the content literacy, and I don't know what else would be in that bucket, but I think we have to look at models and curriculum design and then map those back to the things that continue to change, like the standards that continue to change. Would you add anything, either another bucket or some specifics to those two ideas?
I hear what the buckets are again.
Well, I'm going to go back and name the ones I heard them say. One is this free one about really having the political will to stand up and say that bilingualism is an asset approach, and we want to own that as a state. The second one they mentioned was the development of an accountability system, and under that I have assessments, the accountability system itself, longitudinal database, the impact of the funding formula, and the work around compacts, specifically regional compacts. Number 3, I have this idea of leadership and perhaps looking at ODE and a regional delivery model as a way to go about that. And the 2 I added, so number 4 would be model development, identification and development, and then 5th one would be curriculum design.
I'm wondering if you couldn't put the curriculum design in with the model development.
Okay.
I'm going to go back to what Nancy talked about too, of scaling up. I'm awfully excited to see this PowerPoint because it's, to me, I know you guys have been working on this, your consortium, for quite a while, but just to hear the passion from principals on the ground floor and to see models that are working. And I think that's what districts need right now is some real hope with this population that we know what's the best practice, because a comment that was made earlier that we've been heavily relying on our ELL teachers to be the ones to develop a quote model, and it varies, and then you have turnover, and there's no rhyme or reason across the state of Oregon except what you guys are putting together. And I would like to see our number one bucket, besides calling it out, is let's start scaling up what is working with this consortium right now.
Okay.
Mark, that's a great comment. I think sometimes when we have hesitancy for people to jump on board and to start, really working at making a difference for our English language learners, I think it comes down to two issues. Either one, they don't care enough, it's not of concern enough to them, or two, they have a lack of information and they don't know what to do. And I hope that people that are not taking action on this, I hope it's the second one. I hope they have a lack of information and they don't know what to do. And so scaling up what's working and getting that word out, I think that's really wise.
Another team that spun out of the collaborative is a team that includes folks from TSPC, Oregon universities, and superintendents that is addressing the issue of that our teacher force doesn't necessarily match the needs of our student force. Another way of saying that is we need a way to train teachers in our universities and license them through TSPC so that we have the teachers who are appropriate for teaching bilingually in content areas or for early literacy in 2 languages. I think when school districts see those rays of hope in schools in other districts that are doing it right, quote unquote, the frustration tends to be, where do I find the kinder teacher to start that program? And it's a struggle for us to find the staff with the appropriate training and the license to do this work.
Which aligns right to our strategic initiative with the Student Achievement Centers.
Nice.
So I put as a number 6 developing teachers, and part is that initial license piece, and bilingual is part of it, but it's not all of it, because if we look at those other models, it's the content ELD and constructing meaning and developing literacy ability in all teachers to develop that literacy skill. And then the other thing is that I think that ongoing support for teachers and what that looks like. I don't think we have a roadmap for what that looks like, and clearly we're a district that has suffered from that. What started as probably a pretty strong program kind of just got watered down without that lack of support and clarity about what does continual development of teachers who are teaching those different models look like.
It also, so that as a state, we've been pretty progressive in our teacher preparation as well as our mentoring programs, the mentor grants that are out there. I think it all goes back to that first value as a starting point, that whatever we create as a structure to support our system, our industry, if it's built on a multilingual lens or a multicultural lens, we've got the structures in place already. It means a mentor program that supports teachers who are doing that unique work of teaching in Spanish or teaching bilingually. So really my question would be to ODE, what supports need to be in place for the structures that are currently there to make them multicultural, multilingual? And maybe they're already there, they just need a little extra resourcing.
One other area I just thought if I wanted to bring up, because we are doing it in other venues in the state, and that is the other committee in our ELL collaborative work was around the race conversations and equity conversations. And so we had talked about the possibility of pulling in Oregon Leadership Network that's focusing very much on that piece about developing cultural competency. That focus has mostly been on the leaders, but I do think that's a piece of work we need to grow. I continue to be concerned about some of the approaches we've tried in the state that are, even beyond diversity, which is a really good one, has multiple layers, but eventually it still stops. What we haven't created is a way to create ongoing dialogue and to build the skills of cultural competency in an ongoing way. We've done a really good job of calling out white privilege, of calling out institutional racism, of getting people to start to look at their own beliefs, but what to do next. I think we have a lot of eager people. 3 gentlemen right in front of us are great examples of saying we're going to be committed to this work. But what I find in my own school district, who has been having race conversations way before I got there, probably at least 8 years now, we still haven't moved very far beyond those initial calling out of what the problems are. And I continually run into leaders and teachers saying, show me what to do, just tell me what to do. Because I get it now. You know, I have all these beliefs that took me down this trail of being pretty naive, but now I don't know what the next step is. So I'd like to add to the list that conversation about cultural competency be added to taking a look at this work, because I think it will help us build the passion and commitment around the commitment to bilingual education and looking at an asset approach in all our students. So right now we're talking about literacy and reading, but we know the building of identity and those other things matter as well, and that comes along when you honor their language, but there are other aspects of the whole child to honor in that work.
Yeah, Yvonne, you know, it's interesting because there's like you talked about OLN, and there's other, like Chalkboard has Teach Oregon, which is, you know, their new grants where they're having districts work with universities around how do we make sure teacher training programs are teaching what they need to, you know, so the teachers can enter the classrooms prepared for the way they need, and then how also do universities inform school districts of the evidence-based best practices. So, you know, there's a lot of if you were to map out who's all the people working on pieces, because obviously in the teacher training program, and I think with the standards for teacher training program, there's, you know, standards around you know, cultural competency and stuff like that. So, you know, it would be great if we could map out those major initiatives and just see where people are working on them, because, you know, getting it at the teacher training level is really getting it at the most proactive level we can get it in terms of, you know, helping teachers have the skills they need to you know, to change the dial, move the dial.
So one other thing Rudy asked us to think about today is the link between the things we're hearing about today and the funding priorities or key investments that we've already identified. And I identified 3, but wanted to hear from the committee. I think that the 7 areas we've identified do fit in with the early learning piece. We haven't called that out specifically, but I think it's important to tie that, especially as we look at the whole P20 system. When we talk about how we see the assets of children and how we promote that in early childhood, I don't think there is a separation. I think that just actually starts at that level. The other area is around literacy. I mean, clearly we're talking about having students be literate in all the content areas, so learning to read in English, but that the literacy in this conversation is broader than reading in English, right? It's reading perhaps in multiple languages so they're successful for life, which could be in those other languages. We don't know. And the third one is the teacher effectiveness piece. If we think about best practice, building these models, and not only developing the teachers, but developing the curriculum, I think there's an overlap there. I'd like especially the committee members to kind of speak to anything that's in your mind that feels like direct links to those priorities.
Well, I think 11 through 14, there's also a connection if we're really talking about kids meeting the 40-40-20 goals.
Right, that's right.
You know, if we really want to say this is about getting kids through college, or at least the skills to go into the workforce, and we know these groups have been underrepresented in the 40 and 4-year colleges, you know what I mean, and 2-year
Right.
colleges. So you could create that link too, because it's important.
And I think that Collier chart is exactly the chart you would use to make that argument, right? Because of those high levels at the end.
Yeah.
I think you identified the areas pretty well.
Yeah.
I might draw a connection between the what you just mentioned, Yvonne, around literacy across content areas, and then the statement that that we might suggest that OEIB take a stance around bilingualism as a quality of a career and college-ready student. I think along with media literacy and technology literacy, there's a cultural literacy component to literacy. In a shrinking world, it's important to know how to communicate across cultures, and part of that is reading, writing, speaking, and listening between cultures. I know that as I learned to speak Spanish and live in Mexico, I learned that there's an element to my own literacy when I'm functioning as a professional. I speak and write differently in Spanish than I do in English, and those are skills that are considered cultural competency skills, but they have a lot to do with the way that I've learned to read and write and speak and listen across cultures. So it might be a subset of
Actually, I see it as a bridge between what Nancy just brought up is the 11 to 14 in literacy, right? So it's sort of those adding to the list of the 21st century skills and being explicit about the language piece.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Cultural.
Be huge.
Mark, anything you want to add?
I think I'm good.
Okay.
I think we've got a lot of buckets.
So if we were to take something back from this conversation to the OEIB board, what would we take back?
I'm going to kind of have to, what I'd recommend, Yvonne, is if we could get this on paper, those buckets, and then maybe send it out to us to synthesize it, because on these phone conferences, you can't always see it visually.
Right.
I kind of need to see this conversation, and then I could help streamline it.
Okay. Nancy, anything from you?
No, I feel the same way. I mean, I think we've kind of articulated the priorities, and to me, that's what we should take back. So I just think if we get them on paper, and and it's good to have a conversation with the whole OEIB. So the thing is, they need to have all this useful information. I mean, we all had to learn through the subcommittee, and I don't mean to imply, that I have deep knowledge of this, but I'm more informed. So I think we have to think when we bring this back to really help them, understand, in a really high level what you all learned as part of the collaborative, and then present the recommendations. And I do think connections to other key work in the state is really important, because to me that's the only way we leverage enough resource to make these things happen.
In presenting these priorities, when we decide to do that to OEIB, would we want to do that as board members of this committee, or do we want to invite testimony from Hillsborough team or others as backup to those recommendations?
Well, I think they should be in the room. I think what I've sort of seen is at some point, the recommendation has to come from committee members. So when you have you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. I think we want to move from the subcommittee, I think, is supposed to bring recommendations to the whole committee. So I think committee members, one of us or some of us need to, or all of us, need to bring the recommendation, and then have Hillsborough or you or other people there, or other experts around the state, so that when people have questions, just like we did, there's the appropriate people to enter the conversation.
Great.
Yeah, I'd like to expand on I'm seeing what we're saying here as a committee is put some of this down in writing, but I'm seeing it as the first draft of a report, and I'd like to expand on it with some other resources, some other experts, particularly in these 4 areas: bilingual as asset, statewide and district-wide accountability systems, resources in support of the ODE, and model development and curriculum. I think we could have a more comprehensive report on that if we brought in some more experts in those areas and backed it up.
Okay.
And I'd also say I know we've kind of rushed things before in the past year, and I prefer we just take a little more of a pace that allows us to go more in depth on this and have, I think, a more in-depth report and comprehensive report when we're done. So the other members of the committee are fine with that. I say let's go at a pace that we can bring in more people and see this more in depth and more comprehensively.
Well, you know, this is Nancy. I actually have mixed feelings about that because the children are in school right now. And, you know, I'm thinking, so that means to me, like, let's get into action. But on the other hand, you know, one thing that I saw that worked well was the literacy task force at OD. I've heard kind of a recommendation that OD's been helpful and they could be more helpful. And I know in the literacy task force, you know, we did bring in, like in that case, people like Michael Kurth from Stanford, whoever, to help us develop. We basically did a rubric or an assessment too and make some recommendations. So, you know, I'm wondering if there's a way to do a bit of that, but also be really conscious of the fact these children are in school getting pull-out programs where we're looking at data saying it doesn't put them on a trajectory for 40-40-20. So I have a sense of urgency. So I'm wondering if we can get to a balance point.
So I'm wondering if or probably the next step might be to reconvene some form of the collaborative along with ODE and other partners that are doing some work, and put before them this sort of list of buckets of work and start to draft out what we think those deliverables could be. I mean, we've all been doing this and are so close to the work. I don't think that would take us a lot of time to identify those deliverables. And I think there are some things that we're pretty much ready to do. I mean, we're pretty clear about what those recommendations would be and why we need them, the assessments being one of them. And especially as we think about in 2 years, we're moving to smarter balance. I mean, and the state looking at purchasing new tests and stuff. We need to be ready for that conversation and not miss an opportunity. There are others, like the development of the models, that might be one of the deliverables is to get more research and information about. So I think there are some things that could come first and others that we continue to develop. I don't know how the rest of you think about it.
Well, Nancy, let's say, yeah, I shouldn't have said relaxed. So not relaxed, but not hectic. Urgent and
I
in
could
depth.
go for not hectic.
Let's go with that. Let's go with
thoughtful,
that. Okay.
right?
You know, and I think the truth is there's things we could start and then there's things we could study more. You know what I'm saying? You could probably do both of them together.
Good.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to write down the words to do this work thoughtfully and intentionally, but continue to maintain the urgency and the passion of getting there right now so we don't see these giant numbers of kids not graduating that Mike put before us today. So I would like to take at least these recommendations back to Rudy. I know that at the last meeting we had asked him to sort of draft what he saw as the place to go. So in our conversation, we agreed that we would meet on the phone this weekend to do this work. In the meantime, I think we'll also be working with ODE on a way to bring us back together. And I just want to make sure that people understand, at least from where I come from, as from the beginning when we started the collaborative, a lot of the people who are at the table are now in different places. So it will naturally grow the invitation list. And so always the challenge is try to figure out how we get the right people in the room, but also not so many people that we can't move forward. Although I think we have a pretty good model for doing that. Mike has created a great model. Actually, it helped to have that facilitator who knew nothing about ELL.
Yes,
That was a brilliant idea on your part. How about any other thoughts or questions? I think we've got a lot of concrete information on the table today.
We want to thank you for the opportunity to be part of this conversation, and we stand ready to help. Let us know how we can be of assistance.
Nancy, Mark, any?
No, I think you did a great job. Thank you.
I appreciate the email visuals as well. This is felt like I was in the loop here, and guys, your passion came through the phone. So keep up the good work and for our kids.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. And before we convene the meeting, I just need to check, do we have any public testimony today? So we're actually a little bit ahead of schedule. So I'll go ahead and adjourn our meeting at, what time is it? 10:12.
Thank you, guys. Thanks a lot. It's good to meet you.
Get back in touch with you.
Yep, perfect.
Okay.
Sounds good.
Sounds good.